So, good afternoon, everyone, or evening or morning, I suppose, depending on where you're joining us from today. You're all very welcome to our first installment of 2022's HRB Trials Methodology Research Network webinar series. So happy New Year to everyone. My name is Simone Lepage and I'm the webinar coordinator. And our speaker today is Kate Edgar. Kate completed her master's in medical statistics at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine in 2019. And as part of an NIHR fellowship, she stayed there as a research assistant in the medical statistics department, working with Professor Linda Sharples on multi-level models and subgroup analysis. Since then, she started her PhD using causal mediation analysis to investigate a trial of hospital at home versus hospital care for older persons. Kate's presentation today, including random center effects in design, analysis, and presentation of multi-center trials, is based on a project that she did while working with Linda Sharples in the medical statistics department as a research assistant. They were interested in an application of random effects models to a hierarchical data set and investigating different sources of variation in a large clinical trial. So before I hand over to Kate, I'd like to remind everyone that this is being recorded, and Kate was so kind as to agree to share her slides. So both of those will be available on our website shortly after the webinar. It normally takes us about a week. If you have any questions today, please do type those into the Q&A or the chat box, and Kate and I will try to, I'll moderate and Kate will try to address them after her presentation has finished. So Kate, I will hand over to you now. Thanks very much, and I'm looking forward to this.
Thanks, Simone. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me to give this talk. So this talk is on including random center effects in design, analysis, and presentation of multi-center trials. So I'm going to begin with some background on multi-center trial methods. Then I'm going to talk a bit about the motivating example for this work, which was the CRASH-2 trial, and then discuss what prompted our additional analyses. Then go through the methods that we used, our results, and then a bit about a response to some criticism that the trial received, and then finally some conclusions. So I'm sure that most of you know what a multi-center trial is. It's a trial with multiple centers who recruit patients, and there are different options for how to deal with multiple centers. You might do it at different stages of the process. So you could just ignore the fact that there are multiple centers in the trial. You could address it during the design phase of the trial, or you could account for it during analysis, and you might do both 2 and 3, which I'll talk about in a bit. And so if we think about option 1, just ignoring the centers. So when we analyze trials that don't have multiple centers, we're assuming that all the patient observations are independent. And if you have a trial with multiple centers, but you're ignoring this fact, then you're still making this assumption of independence. But that is now incorrect, because patients within the same center will be more similar and have more similar outcomes than patients from different centers. And so when you ignore this, you get bias. And so you could address this during the design phase of the trial. And you could do this by stratifying by center, so that you'll have similar proportions of treatment assignments across centers. And then that means you won't have systematic differences between the treatment groups caused by differences between the different centers. Obviously, sometimes this might be hard to do, and it does add another layer of complexity to the randomization process. It also might have implications for your analysis. So Kahan and Morris showed that when balanced randomization has been used, all balancing factors should be adjusted for in the analysis to avoid biased standard errors. And they showed that an adjusted analysis led to large p-values and a loss of power for both continuous and binary outcomes. And therefore, it's generally recommended in this case that center effects should be accounted for in the analysis. But this is not always done, and it can be problematic in situations where there are few patients per centre or a large number of centres, as it can involve estimating a large number of parameters with few data. And so the third option is to account for centre in the analysis. And you can do that in different ways. And two ways are fixed effects models or random effects models. And the choice of model depends on the type of data that you have. And in cases where there are few centres in the trial, a fixed effects model is preferable because you don't have many additional parameters to estimate. But in cases where there are many centres, and some perhaps with few patients, then a random effects model is preferable, as it doesn't require estimating lots and lots of parameters, as I'll go into. And it's been shown that for continuous outcomes, that random effects models perform as well or better than fixed effects models in a variety of situations, leading to increased power and precision. And similarly, for binary outcome, it was found that both methods performed well with a small number of centres, and random effects models or generalized estimating equations should be used when you have a large number of centres. And so to talk a bit more about random effects models, so this allows you to include a parameter for centre, which can vary according to a normal distribution. Usually a normal distribution, you can use other distributions. So that each centre has a different baseline rate of the outcome. And this allows us to quantify the amount of variation which is due to centre. A benefit of random effects models is they also allow you to explore centre level variables as sources of variation. So you can look into why there might be differences between centres. And so this project was an application of random effects models in a large clinical trial with many centres, some of which were small. I'm going to talk about the trial now. So the motivating example was the CRASH-2 trial published in 2013. And this was a very large randomized controlled trial looking at the effect of the drug Tranexamic Acid on death and other outcomes in bleeding trauma patients. And they randomized 20,000 patients to either tranexamic acid or placebo, stratifying by age, sex, and other clinical characteristics, and also stratifying by centre, enrolling patients between 2005 and 2010. So a bit more about tranexamic acid. Here it was used in trauma patients who were at risk of significant bleeding. And patients in the treatment group received a loading dose infused over 10 minutes, followed by an intravenous infusion over 8 hours. And tranexamic acid is an antifibrinolytic, which means it helps blood to clot and thereby prevents severe bleeding and death. And so just to highlight that, it's quite a simple intervention, which can be administered the same way across different settings. And so the CRASH-2 trial, its structure was a 3-level hierarchy of the data. And this diagram is just showing us a sort of mini example of a 3-level hierarchy. So we have the patients at level 1, and then the hospitals or centres at level 2. Each hospital has a different number of patients in the trial. And then in this case, we had level 3, which was the country that these hospitals are in. And so, like I said, there were around 20,000 patients in the trial from 274 hospitals in 40 countries. And just a bit more about the trial. So many hospitals, many countries, and the countries were spread across 6 continents, so they were all over the world. And half of the patients were allocated to tranexamic acid, half to placebo. A small number withdrew their consent after randomization, and a small number were lost to follow-up. The primary outcome was death within 4 weeks of injury, and a similar number of the patients were analysed as were randomized. So the proportion of patients who died in the treatment group was 14.5%, and in the placebo group, it was 16%. And in the primary analysis, they found that this equated to tranexamic acid significantly reducing the all-cause mortality risk with a relative risk of 0.91. And their analysis was unadjusted given the large sample size and the stratification. So what prompted additional analysis? So only 2% of the patients in the trial were from high-income countries. And after it was published, there was concern from some investigators who said that the first knowledge gap concerns the efficacy of tranexamic acid in patients treated to modern trauma care standards. In trauma systems with far fewer preventable deaths, it seems unlikely that tranexamic acid could have equivalent mortality benefits. So they were basically concerned that because there weren't many patients from high-income settings in the trial, that meant that the results of the trial potentially could not be generalized to high-income settings. But the trialists argued in response that because we know the biological mechanism associated with tranexamic acid, so we know how it works, therefore it can benefit any patient regardless of where they are treated. And also we know that it's a simple intervention, and so there's limited scope for the way it's delivered to affect how well it works. But I think the criticism was because they might think that because high-income countries potentially have better facilities and infrastructure for treatment, that they will have better outcomes in general. But they seem to be conflating the variation in outcome with variation in the treatment effect, in how well the treatment itself works across settings. And so we wanted to assess the variance in outcome and treatment effect between centres and countries in the CRASH-2 trial and clarify their interpretation. And also to compare the treatment effect from an unadjusted analysis with that from analysis which accounts for between country and centre variance using random effects models. And because the trial was stratified by centre, we expected that the treatment effect would not change when we adjusted for this variation. And finally, we wanted to explore why there might be centre and country variation by investigating centre and country level covariates. So to talk about the methods that we used, when you ignore centre and country effects, the log odds of death takes this form. So we have beta 0, which is the intercept, the log odds of death in the control group with all covariates equal to 0. Beta 1 is the log odds ratio for the treatment group relative to the control group, adjusting for covariates, where we have t equals 0 or 1 for the control and treatment group. And then beta 2 is a vector of coefficients for the covariates that you adjust for. And so if this was a primary analysis we were doing, we would have specified the model prior to analysis during the trial design and stuck to that. But this was a secondary analysis, and so we wanted to take a more exploratory approach. And so we aimed to find the optimal random effect structure for these data. And so we began by considering the full possible random effect structure. And in this notation, we have I is patient, J is centre or hospital, and K is country. And so we have U0JK, which is a random intercept, which varies by centre within country. And this allows the odds of death, which is, so death within 4 weeks is the outcome we're looking at. So this allows the outcome to vary by centre. And then we also had a random coefficient for centre. So a random coefficient for treatment, also known as a random slope, allowing the treatment effect to vary by centre within country. And then the same for country. So V0K is a random intercept allowing the odds of death to vary by country. And then V1K is a random coefficient for treatment, which varies by country. So this is the full random effect structure that we initially considered. And these random effects have these normal distributions. So we use normal distributions on a logit scale, which is usual but not strictly necessary. And we assumed an exchangeable covariance structure for the random effects with independence between the intercepts and the coefficients, meaning that these covariances equal 0. And so we developed a final model using these two steps. So first we used a saturated model, meaning it included many fixed effects covariates. And we compared different random effect structures using likelihood ratio tests. And after identifying the optimal structure, we simplified the fixed effect structure using stepwise selection. And this was the final model which we landed on. And this final model, in terms of random effects, it only included a random intercept for center and a random intercept for country. So it didn't include the random coefficients for treatment. And we adjusted for systolic blood pressure, age squared, systolic blood pressure squared, Glasgow coma score, which is a measure of consciousness, I think, which was categorical, time from injury, and type of injury, which was penetrating or blunt. And so to think about the results of the trial, the death rate varied very widely by country. So this figure shows we have all the countries that were in the trial on the left, and then on the x-axis we have death rate as a percentage in each country, and we also have the number of patients from each country in the trial. So you can see it varied widely. For example, Nigeria had around 2,000 patients in the trial with a death rate of around 23%, whereas Colombia also had thousands of patients in the trial, but they had a lower death rate of like 13%. So you can see that some countries had very few patients, like Bangladesh only had 12 and Canada only had 2 patients in the trial. And then some had thousands. So India had, India had like nearly 5,000 patients in the trial. And so these are the results of our secondary analysis. So we did an unadjusted analysis using fixed effect logistic regression. Then we adjusted for patient characteristics. And then we used a mixed effect logistic regression model with random intercepts for country and center to take into account between country and center differences. And what we found was what we expected, was that the odds ratio did not change of the treatment effect between the unadjusted analysis and the fully adjusted analysis. And the standard error only increased slightly. And we also found a significant amount of variation in underlying outcome between countries and between centers within countries. And perhaps an easier way to think about it is by using the intra-class correlation coefficient, or ICC. And this measures how much of the total variability is explained by, so A, the between center variance in the same country, and B, the between country variance. So because we have a 3-level hierarchy, we have 2 ICCs, one for country and one for center. And these ICCs can also be interpreted as how correlated patients are, either within the same center or in the same country, but not the same center. So we found that for centers in the same country, they had a correlation of 16.4%. And patients in the same country, adjusting for center, had a correlation of 6%. And you work these out using these formulae. So the ICC for centre was the variance for country plus the variance for the between country variance and the between centre variance over the total variance. So sigma squared E here is the residual variance. And then for country, it's the between country variance over the total variance. And if you're thinking about the ICC for centre, just to explain it a bit more, so if it was 1, then that would mean that outcomes for participants in the same centre were perfectly correlated. And if it was 0, then outcomes for participants in the same centre would have 0 correlation. And any bias or loss of power due to not accounting for between centre and country variation depends on how correlated patients in these categories are. So this forest plot shows how the outcome varied across centres. So it's showing the odds ratios for each centre for death in 4 weeks relative to the average centre. So if you think the average centre on here has an odds ratio of 1, and then this line is made up of all the dots which represent the different centres as odds ratios relative to the average centre. And these odds ratios ranged from 0.29 to 3.5. So the range is from approximately 1/3 to 3 times the average odds of death. And this between centre variance has accounted for country variance. So the ICC of 16%. So it suggests that the centres accounted for 16.4% of the total variation in death rates within the same country. And in contrast, we then looked at possible variation in the treatment effect. We did this by adding a random slope to the model for centre for treatment effect. And so we plotted the odds ratios relative to the average centre. And as you can see, there was no variation. So it just formed this black line because we found no variation or very little variation in the treatment effect. And we also looked at country. So here we have the log odds ratios for death for each country plotted with these different colours relative to the average country. So countries here which are more yellow have lower odds of death than the average country, and countries which are more red have higher log odds of death than the average country. And you can see there's a lot of variation. If you just look at Egypt and Saudi Arabia, they have very different rates of death. And these odds ratios ranged from 0.39 to 2.59. And yeah, a reminder that the ICC said that country differences accounted for 6% of the total variation in death rates. And then in a similar way, we then added a random slope for country to the model, and we found very little variation in the treatment effect across countries. So that's why they all appear as the same colour when you plot the log odds ratios for treatment effect relative to the average, because there was no variation in treatment effect. And so to investigate the variation in outcome, we looked at some centre and country level variables, and we found that that centres with a high proportion of patients who had a severe Glasgow Coma score, those centres had increased death rates. So the proportion of patients with severe Glasgow Coma score was associated with higher risk of death. And for every 10% increase in the percentage of cases with severe GCS, the odds of death were 11.5 times higher. So this is a patient level characteristic of Glasgow Coma score, but we studied it at centre level by turning it into the proportion of patients within each centre who had severe Glasgow Coma score, as opposed to moderate, or mild. And so from this result, we might speculate that these centres had higher death rates because perhaps those hospitals were overwhelmed with severely ill patients or other centre-specific reasons. And we also found that income was related to death rates. So low to lower middle income countries had higher death rates than higher income countries, with 1.25 times higher odds of death. So to go back to the criticism that I spoke about earlier that the trial received, so they raised concerns about the generalizability of CRASH-2 to high income settings. And this seemed to conflate variation in outcomes and variation in the treatment effect. And we've seen that there was no evidence for variation of the treatment effect across countries and centres in this trial. And this is supported by the biological mechanism of the drug as an antifibrinolytic, meaning it helps clotting. And the trialists had quite a good way of illustrating their argument. So Roberts and Prieto Marino illustrated how two centres could have different risks of death in the control group, but the relative risk comparing the treatment group and the control group can still be the same. So the treatment effect can still be the same. So we have centre 1, which has 20 patients and a baseline risk of death of 60%. So that's the risk of death in the control group. And then the relative risk is calculated as the risk in the treatment group over the risk in the control group, and you get 0.67. You get a risk difference of 20%. And then in centre 2, you have 40 patients and you have a baseline risk of death of 30%, so a lower baseline risk. But when you calculate the relative risk, it's still the same. So because the treatment is having the same effect, even though the risk difference is smaller. And so in both centres, the biological effect of the treatment is the same, corresponding to a 1/3 reduction in the risk of death. So the relative risk is the same in both trials, but the risk difference is not the same. But the relative risk is a generalizable measure of the biological effect of treatment, whereas the risk difference is not generalizable. And in this example, they're using relative risks, and in our analyses, we used odds ratios, and we found that on the odds ratio scale, there was no variation in treatment effect across centres or countries. And because of the large size of the data set, it won't make a huge difference that we use the odds ratio scale as opposed to the risk ratio scale. More recently, the CRASH-3 trial was published in 2019, and this looked at the effect of tranexamic acid, more specifically on patients with acute traumatic brain injury. And again, they randomized thousands of patients across many hospitals and countries, and they found that the drug reduced the risk of head injury related death in patients with mild to moderate head injury. And to support their argument, they also found no statistical evidence of heterogeneity by country income group. And so to conclude, we have seen the importance of distinguishing between outcome variation and treatment effect variation. And in the CRASH-2 trial, the treatment effect estimate did not change when between centre and country variation was accounted for, because they stratified by centre. So you could argue that, so they didn't originally adjust for the centre and country. And so you could argue that that's fine because it didn't change the treatment effect. However, it has been argued that when you don't account, this leads to incorrect type 1 error rates and a loss of power. And so there isn't really a consensus on when and how centre variance should be adjusted for, and there are lots of different situations. that could arise. And so current guidelines focus on possible heterogeneity of the treatment effect and cases where you have small centres. And we did our own simulation studies, and we found that for binary outcome, type 1 error rates were inflated when between centre variance was ignored, and particularly if centres had unequally sized treatment allocation. So when centres varied in the proportion of patients which they allocated to treatment, this meant that type 1 error rates were particularly inflated. So here are my references, and thank you for listening to my talk.